Prague off the beaten track, Vít Pohanka takes you away from the crowds to the city's hidden gems.
Hello and welcome to Prague off the beaten track. Last time I took you deep beneath the Vyšehrad fortress into its Baroque-era casemates, and frankly that visit left me wondering what else remains of Prague's Baroque fortifications, because the city used to be kind of walled around, and the walls weren't just a random kind of vanity projects by ambitious rulers. They were really built out of fear and experience, specifically after the painful experience of the 30 Years' War. Because when that brutal conflict erupted in 1618, Prague was woefully unprepared, and the Battle of White Mountain, just outside the city in 1620, ended in a quick and decisive defeat for the Protestant forces of, mostly Czech nobility. And while Prague wasn't destroyed like some other European cities during the war, the conflict definitely exposed how vulnerable the city really was. Now, there were some medieval walls and fortresses, of course, like Vyšehrad that we visited, which was fortified ever since the Middle Ages. Hradčany, of course, the Prague castle. There were also some other old town fortifications, but they were not sufficient to withstand the kind of evolving tactics and firepower of early modern warfare. Artillery became much more powerful, and the cities needed kind of star-shaped bastions, casemates, and full network of defensive lines. And that's why, during the 17th and the 18th centuries, the Habsburgs undertook a massive effort to fortify Prague as a strategic stronghold of their empire. A ring of bastions and walls began to encircle the city, especially on the left bank of the Vltava, where attacks from the west were most likely. So, curious to find out what's left beyond Vyšehrad, where I recorded the last episode in its underground, I crossed the river today, and after a brief internet search, I ended up in quite an unexpected place, where, kind of hidden, but at the same time in plain sight, not far from Hradčany, the Prague castle, are the remains of the Mariánské hradby, or the Marian ramparts. They were so called because not far from here was a church of Saint Mary. So I will tell you a little bit more in a minute, but let me tell you about this place where I'm walking right now. And here I have to make a bit of a digression. The man whose name this park bears was quite an important figure in Czechoslovak history, but much later on, after these ramparts that you can see here were built. It was in the 1970s. Max van der Stoel, as he is pronounced, as I found out on YouTube, was a Dutch diplomat, politician, and a staunch advocate for human rights. And these were principles that brought him into direct contact with Czechoslovakia during one of its, I would say, darkest periods. In the 1970s, during the so-called normalization, Max van der Stoel served as the Netherlands foreign minister, and he visited Czechoslovakia in 1977 at the height of the kind of communist repression. And he became the first, and for a long time the only Western politician who publicly expressed support for Charter 77, a manifesto calling on the Czechoslovak government to respect human rights, as it had basically promised when it signed the Helsinki Accords, or the Helsinki Declaration, a couple of years earlier in 1975. And van der Stoel came to Prague in March 1977, and he met Jan Patočka, a philosopher who was the original, I think, spokesperson of Charter 77. They met in a Prague hotel, and this was something totally unprecedented. And the regime's response was imminent and telling. Then Communist President Gustav Husák immediately cancelled a scheduled meeting with van der Stoel in protest. clearly, I think, signaling how sensitive and unwelcome such gestures of solidarity were. The communist government then was really trying to silence dissenters and isolate them completely from the outside world. And van der Stoel's visit sent a powerful message. The world was kind of watching. Unfortunately, just to finish this digression, Jan Patočka underwent a very harsh interrogation by the communist secret police as a result of this meeting, and he tragically died a few days later. And his friends thought that it was because of the harsh interrogation. But I don't think that anyone blamed Max van der Stoel, of course. By contacting him, Jan Patočka, he in a way legitimized Charter 77 and brought it needed, I think, very needed international attention, which was something the communist regime naturally hated. So, today, the legacy of Max van der Stoel is honored right here in the park that bears his name. But of course, back to the main subject of this Prague of the Beaten Track episode, the main unmissable features of this park are the massive stone and brick Baroque ramparts and a bastion that border the park in, if I look correctly, from about two sides. They are kind of irregular, but you can see them, and you can try to imagine what Prague would have looked like if if all these ramparts stayed and they were not demolished. If you come closer to the walls, like I do right now, you'll notice something quite curious. There are old gravestones set in the walls, and that's because this spot was once the site of the Hradčany military cemetery established in the 1780s, and for nearly I would say a century and a half, they served as a burial ground for soldiers, officers and their families of the Prague garrison, obviously. And the cemetery was closed, as I read, in 1932, and much of it was later removed. But a few remnants, like these gravestones, still kind of quietly tell the story. There's a very nice little lake in the middle of the park, and right now, when I'm here, it's a beautiful, I would even say a spring day. It's not spring yet, actually. It will not be spring for a few days. But the weather is really nice. And again, this is quite similar to the podcast that I did from Nový Svět, not far from here. I'm very, very close to Hradčany, but the park is nearly deserted. And yet it is kind of well kept. And it's a very pleasant place where you can, I suppose, have a picnic even near the small lake in one part of the park. There's also a children's playground, but it's quite empty now on a working day. Be it as it may, these massive fortifications definitely, as I read, didn't help Prague much during the War of the Austrian Succession in the 18th century, because Allied armies of France and Bavaria started a siege in late 1741, and when the heavily overwhelmed and outnumbered Prague garrison refused to capitulate, the French and Bavarian troops managed to scale these ramparts at several places during a night attack and occupied Prague for several months. And just a few years later, it was the Prussian army that again managed to get to Prague despite the fortifications and occupied it for a change, I would say. But it needs to be said that these Baroque ramparts obviously did help to defend the city during the next chapter of the war, which in this case became worldwide conflict known in the English-speaking world as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in North America. And during that conflict in the 1750s, Prague was again besieged by the Prussian army. The city was heavily bombarded and suffered significant damage, but the Prussians didn't manage to occupy it. They didn't manage to scale these ramparts, and they didn't get to the city as they did only 13 years earlier. Now, by the end of the 18th century, the massive stone fortifications that once made cities like Prague feel kind of secure had begun to lose their military relevance. Advances in artillery meant that no matter how thick the walls were, they could be breached from a distance with increasing ease. The older model of warfare, where armies laid siege for weeks or months and relied on scaling walls or cutting off supplies, gave way to faster, much more mobile campaigns supported by long-range, powerful cannon fire during the Napoleonic Wars. Fortified cities could still slow down an enemy, but they were no longer the kind of impenetrable strongholds that they had once been. And for a growing capital, and for a growing city like Prague, encircled by outdated defensive structures, the walls became more of a constraint than a protection. They limited urban expansion for a time, choked off traffic, and no longer served a vital purpose in national defense. So this kind of changing reality eventually led to a major shift in city planning. And in the 19th century, many of the once formidable ramparts around Prague were gradually demolished. The military formally ceded control of them in the mid-1800s, and the massive walls and bastions were being torn down in several waves to make room for new streets, squares and public parks. And in place of military barriers, Prague embraced some boulevards, like today's Národní třída, if you know the place. So you could say that what had once protected the city with cannons and garrisons now gave way to trams, commerce and civil life. So I walked around the park for a while, trying to get a better sense of the fortifications that remain here. Most of the ramparts that still survive are not accessible. They are kind of fenced off and you can't get to the top. I suppose it will be quite dangerous anyway, because people could fall, and they are really tall fortifications. But there is one small section that is open to the public with a few benches and a sort of viewing area where I'm standing now. From here you get really a wonderful perspective, not just of the park itself, but also of how close you are to some of the Prague's iconic landmarks. The massive Černín Palace, which houses the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is just across the street. Hradčany beyond, and of course the spires of St. Vitus Cathedral rise up clearly in the distance. On a beautiful March day like this, with a cloudless blue sky overhead, this view is truly something. And yet there are very few people here. It's a charming, peaceful park, really tucked right next to the usual tourist routes, or I would even say tourist traps. And most visitors, I think, pass it by. If you ever need a quiet place to rest your feet and soak in a bit of hidden history, this is definitely one of those spots that rewards curiosity. Let me just finally say that there are other, but rather small and isolated remnants of Prague fortifications that were preserved on this side of the Vltava River. I think Písecká brána, Písek Gate, where the road to the South Bohemian town of Písek started, is perhaps the best known and popular. It is a part of another park, closer to the Prague Castle, and it was very nicely restored quite recently. There is a cafe and a gallery for exhibitions, and there's a kind of space that you can rent for a wedding or some other social event. Let me just add that for me, these remnants of what was supposed to be a kind of mighty defense of Prague are in a way a reminder that people tend to prepare for a previous war, and military developments and technology render such often quite massive investments into defenses such as these ramparts quite useless, or, as in the case of Prague, as I mentioned, only partially effective. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for joining me on this walk through Prague's layered past. I hope this glimpse into the city's Baroque fortifications and the quiet park that preserves a piece of that history might inspire you too to keep looking beyond the obvious. As always, you can find some practical information, photos and a map on Prague of the Beaten Track pages at radio.cz. I'm Vít Pohanka, and until next time, happy exploring. a naslyšenou.
Prague off the beaten track, Vít Bochanka takes you away from the crowds to the city's hidden gems.